As a committee of the whole meeting, there'll be no decisions made here today. Recommendations from today will be forwarded to the regular council meeting on October 22nd. I need a motion for the adoption of the agenda, that the agenda for the open session of the Committee of the Whole of Tuesday, October 8th, 2019 be adopted as circulated and with the following amendment. Additional correspondence, item 6.2.4, and a memo regarding full winter maintenance for cul-de-sac accessing Francis Street in Fenland Falls from Councillor Doug Elmsley. So if I can get a motion for that, Councillor Elmsley and Councillor Richardson. All in favor? That's passed. Thank you. Is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest on anything on today's agenda? Seeing none, we'll move right into deputations. Our first deputation is item 4.1, application to add additional street numbers to 70 Mount Hope Street in Lindsay from Mr. Michael Bosley. I don't see Mr. Bosley here. I've sort of dealt with this issue through the owner of the building, but maybe Mr. Bosley's decided not to come, but we'll see if he shows up a little later on. We'll move down to item 4.2, which is a request for resolution of support for the Demand the Right Coalition, requesting municipalities have the right to approve or reject future landfill developments in their communities. And a very warm welcome to Mr. Mayor Ted Kaminski, Mayor of Ingersoll. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much for allowing me to be here today.
Get you to put that microphone on if you can. You got it.
There, how's that? All right.
And I'll just remind everybody for deputations that you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
I will talk fast. Okay. The situation is that I'm here as a chair of the Demand the Right Coalition to allow municipalities to have the right to say yes or no to landfills. And I will take you back to 2012. I was in my office when a request came that a group of people were here to speak to me about waste. It is certainly waste is handled by the upper tier of Oxford County. And so really I had a lot of concern on it at that point in time, was trying to push them off to the county. But going in and speaking with them certainly was an eye-opener. The company involved brought it to our attention that they are very interested in going to be making a proposal to the Ministry of Environment to bring 18 million ton of Toronto and Greater Toronto waste to a landfill that is positioned 800 meters from our subdivision. It is actually not in the town of Ingersoll. It is actually the borderline goes between that 800 meters into the township of Zora. Not that it would make any difference, because they don't have to ask Zora either whether they can make this proposal. After I picked up my jaw off the table, I certainly did my best to find out, how is this possible? How does this come about that they can come forward at this point in time and bring it to my attention that they are going to make this proposal without even asking the municipalities around? There is a waste problem that Toronto has. And Toronto right now has agreed that there will be no landfills within the boundaries and also into the green area. So in other words, the symbol or the line, I suppose, here we go, taking that back one. Here it is, GTA garbage coming soon to a site near you. And that is that they have to take it somewhere. That's a disappointing part, that the fact that they have, and they produce as such, 6.7 million ton per year of waste, and they have to find a spot for it. And they have picked the county of Oxford as being their kitty litter box as such. And we're saying, hold it here. Something's wrong. We should have the right to do something about this. Right now, the procedure is that if they bring out the terms of reference, which is a list of tests that are going to take place on putting in a landfill, and they complete that terms of reference, get it approved, which they did. That list then says what type of environmental assessments have to take place over the next, which they did over the last 3 years or so, and to be brought forward to the ministry, but not necessarily to us. We can comment, but we can't say yes or no. Municipalities demand the right to approve any proposal landfill sites within the adjacent to their community. I'm sorry, I'm going backwards here. We deserve the right The situation is that you cannot go to another municipality and say, we are going to bring all this waste to you. Landfills today aren't landfills what they used to be. I'm from the farm, I'm sorry, and back when I was a kid, we did take the bottles and the tin cans back to the back 40 where there was a hollow, and we actually did fill those hollows with garbage. But it was tin and it was bottles. I'm not saying that it was a good thing, it's a bad thing. We shouldn't have done it. But today's garbage isn't the same. If you go home and look at your upholstered couch, the toxics that are in there and the chemicals that are put together to make that from China or wherever, the foams that are in there, all the different things that we're putting right now chemically wise into our landfills are going to come back to haunt us in about 20 to 30 years because they're going to make a leachate down at the bottom of there that we have no idea what it is going to be made up of. What kind of toxins mixed together? Anybody who had their little chemistry set when they were a kid sometimes put the wrong things together and it foamed over onto the carpet or wherever in the heck it is. But the fact is that some things should not be combined, and we have no idea what is going into the products today that we're taking to landfills and burying. And you and I don't have to worry about this. It'll be our kids and our grandkids that this leachates are either going to come to the top, go into our water system, or into our air, and they are going to travel from A to B. The procedure is that we can only be standbyers at this point in time. Today, I have just received 5 more municipalities that have jumped on board and said that we demand the right to say yes or no. We now have 126 to 127. How many do I need? I don't know, but I'm not going to stop until the ministry takes a serious look at this, which they are today, taking a very, very serious look at this and saying what will happen. Am I asking you to say no to landfills? No. I'm saying that you deserve the right to be able to say yes or no. You deserve the right to be able to say, no, Ted, I'm not going to take 18 million ton of your waste and put it in my backyard. They're looking for quarries, they're looking for systems. We have a live limestone quarry. Carmoose Lime is where it's going, and it's an active pit. It's a pit that's made up of limestone. Limestone is porous. Leachates will travel. The ministry itself says today there is not a liner that will not leak. They all do. Well, what's the severity of it, and where does it leak to? Back a few years ago, I think that you would remember Bill 139, where the OMB was in question whether it was going to exist anymore, and actually it was dissolved for a while, and it looks like it'll come back. I had the opportunity to go down to Queen's Park, and I argued the fact that Bill 139 was giving more responsibility to the municipalities. Here is the time that we should be incorporating into this to giving municipalities the right. All the Conservatives were keen on it. All the NDPs were keen on it. Certainly they were in opposition. I even had a few Liberals that were very, very interested, but said that it really wouldn't fit the bill at that point in time, Bill 139, that it didn't really fit that criteria and would not enter it into it. Right after that, MPP Ernie Hardeman put a private member's bill forward saying that municipalities deserve the right to say yes or no to landfills. It went past first and second reading, and then the election came forward. While the election was coming forward, I went to the leaders, and every one of the leaders agreed that this should be put into legislation. In fact, as a former city councillor, I respect the right for local municipalities to make the decisions best for their communities. If you want to bring a casino to this community, they ask council. If they want to bring wind turbines, they ask council. If they want to sell marijuana downtown, they'll ask council. But they don't for a landfill. Nuclear waste needs a spot to have nuclear waste. They sent word out to all municipalities across Ontario, and they had 27 returns saying they'd be interested in nuclear waste. I think they're down to 11 now, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be corrected, but I think they're down to 11. And they know they're going to pick one of them because they want it. Proponents to a landfill do not come to a municipality and say, here's what we have to offer, here's our sign. Not that we'd agree with it because of where it's positioned. 800 meals from 13,000 people. 800 meters. We're on well water. We have the Thames River that flows right beside it, will flow within 200 yards of this landfill, go right through into the City of London. Mayor Holder better take a serious look at this, where contaminants may travel to. So anyway, Bill 139 didn't carry it, but now I have a letter from Mr. Ford himself before the election saying that these things should not be forced down the throats of municipality and that he supports. So why am I here? I'm not going to slow down at all. The minister is very interested and very keen, in fact, is very concerned on how he will bring this forward. And I think that's great. I think it will in time. I'm hoping that it comes time soon before something happens dangerously. And why I'm saying that is that if contamination takes place and a small community is affected by it, imagine the disaster that could cause. And is it possible to happen? Well, I use three little silly things, and I know they're silly, but they hit home. And that is that human error can happen. We know that by Walkerton, when human error failed to keep the water pure and people died. We know that can be mechanical because we know nobody ever wanted a shuttle to explode above Florida and pick up the pace. And so it was mechanical. So these things can happen. And even an act of God with having a tsunami wipe out a nuclear reactor on the shores of Japan, nobody ever planned it to happen, but it happens. Why in the world would you put 18 million ton of waste right next to a population of 13,000 people? I've said to Toronto at one point in time, same thing. You got a Don Valley there. If the environmental assessments are going to be perfect, and there's nothing wrong with it at all, why don't you dig a hole in the Don Valley there and just bury it right within the City of Toronto? Well, you know that would never float. What can your municipality do? We can pass the demand and write the motion to council. In fact, you have the right today, which I know, to be able to move a motion today to be able to complete this. Write the Minister Yurek and express your support. I certainly do ask, if nothing else, that you please do that in support of this. Call and meet with your local MPP and discuss your local media and social media. Get the word out, because if it doesn't happen to us, then it's going to happen to potentially you. And you're not going to be able to stop it unless you have the right to say yes or no. Please, I need your support. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll get a motion to receive, and we'll see if there's any questions for you. Councillor Yeo and Elmsley, you'll second that. Any questions for the deputy? Councillor Elmsley?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To you, Mr. Mayor. I know Ingersoll somewhat, being a former CIL employee. So, it's a bit near and dear to me. But in any event, I've always felt that one of the stupidest things we do as a human race is bury garbage, because it's only going to come back to haunt us. So I think we need to find a different and better way of dealing with it. But I agree with you wholeheartedly that we need to have the right to refuse. And Mr. Mayor, I don't know if you are looking for any kind of a motion or anything to take it forward to the next council meeting to have a motion, but...
Well, I might recommend that we receive and refer to staff for a report back with some background information by the end of this year. I think he's got the government on board, but it's not time sensitive, but I think we're on board with it. But let's get all the background information, and then we'll have all the options to make a resolution.
Sure.
If you're okay with that, Councillor Yeo, if we add that to the motion? thank you, and you seconded it, so, okay.
Thanks very much for coming, and thanks for telling us about it.
Thank you. Would there be, Your Worship, would there be a time frame on that motion being brought back to council?
By the end of 2019, by the end of this year. This goes to council in October. Are you looking for something before then?
Yes, sir. I believe that Parliament coming back into session the end of October, I would very much love to see something, certainly a letter of recommendation, or if not, a motion to be passed, if at all possible, before that time frame, if it warrants it. I believe it does. The more participation we have with municipalities on this, the stronger the voice is to have this happen rather than after the fact.
Okay. Councillor Yeo, what do you want to do? Do you want to change your motion to forward it to council to receive and come back with some support resolution options for council next week, 2 weeks? We can get. Okay, are you okay with that, Councillor Yeo, or Councillor Helmsley? I think we can come up with something by the next council meeting and
I
have a few
respect that,
options.
and
so.
thank you very much.
Okay.
Are there any further questions that I could help with?
Are there any further questions? Councillor Riley?
Yeah, I just have a couple. I guess, first of all, thanks very much for coming. And I guess probably you're a little more unique than we are, probably in the sense that it may affect us someday, but you're on a corridor that goes to where the garbage has gone to Michigan for a number of years. And so I suspect that they want to continue to go in that direction. The municipality south of us, the Durham region, has gone forward with an incinerator. Has there been any talk about incineration in your quadrant, London, or whatever? And I say this for twofold. Because first of all, there's probably going to be municipalities that want to host this. Because I was going to bring up the nuclear waste, because we know a number of that. And we also know that when the wind turbines come out with the Green Energy Act, your neighbor, Chatham and Kent, is a willing host, and they have 350 wind turbines and going to 500, or up to 500 is my understanding. So there's probably maybe the municipality next door, I can't speak for it, could be a willing host if there was something that wasn't as close to Ingersoll as you are. So I was just wondering, in light of those issues, is there anybody in your area down there that has talked about an incinerator, for example?
There's a phenomenal amount of discussion going on, and with all municipalities. We know, and you know, that the cheapest way to get rid of waste right now is to bury it. Until that changes, until the word is that, hey, we can no longer bury our waste, then the necessity, being the mother of invention, is going to bring forward many, many ways of dealing with the waste. And we know that by reducing plastics, or reducing styrofoams, or reducing some sort of textiles that are toxic, these things are going to be taking place and things are going to be happening. But it won't happen until the need is there and the ministry stops allowing landfills to take place at the cheap rate it does, and it keeps going on. So yes, these things are happening. I know that the County of Oxford itself is driven to zero waste and is finding out means right now to go to zero waste by 2030.
So you're not familiar with any movement down your way, because we have one in Durham.
Yes, you do. And also Durham signed this motion not too long ago, saying that they reserve the right to say yes or no to landfills. And the Durham one right now, was questionable on its parts per million output of toxics at one point in time. I'm just not too sure where it sits right now with the ministry as far as its ability to fall within the guidelines. So yes, new things are happening, technology's happening, and I'm sure that they will have scrubbers that will overcome this, and this direction will end up going in that way.
I'm speaking for myself, not council, but just saying that, when we deal with the government on a whole, like sometimes it's always a challenge when you go out against the government on one particular item. These are my opinion. Then when you have to deal with them next time, we were looking for funding and from this and this and this, and we know how governments in the past have looked on those favors. So, anyways, that's all I have.
Any further questions? Seeing none, we have a motion to receive. All in favor? That's passed. Thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.
We'll get to work on that and bring forward some options for council on October 22nd.
I thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Have a safe drive home.
Take care, folks.
Okay. Okay, we'll move into item 4.3, which is the drainage water issue at 20 2 Alma Street in Omemee. Miss June Jackson. Welcome, June.
Thank you. Attention, the mayor and all of the councilors. I'm just going to read a letter that I wrote to the mayor, and also all of the councilors have documentation from me regarding my problem. I have been having a problem with flooding in my backyard since the culvert by McFalls at the road allowance since March the 5th, 2011. I have lived here for 30 years with no water problems. 2011, they replaced the culvert and my 2 sheds were underwater for 3 months. City of Kawartha Lakes accepted no responsibility and my insurance would not cover. I have not been able to replace my sheds and would run into, if I did, I would run into the same problem. Since this time, my backyard is sinking into swampland. 2016, I had Mike Farquhar and a surveyor come out and nothing was changed, but at least they sent me a letter stating that they wouldn't do anything. 2019, I had a flood in March that covered the back end of my backyard and backwashed into the ditch. I have been dealing with Ron Ashmore and Mike Farquhar since then. Mike and your map person were supposed to be doing an in-depth survey to get the water flowing faster to the river. They replaced the culvert at Mr. McFalls when the frost was in the ground, with too high and too small of a culvert. The culvert on Mary Street is 4 times as big. I was told all summer that they would get to this after the road repairs were accomplished. I have had to put 50 bags of topsoil and 6 bags of mulch to build up my back garden after the flood in March. September the 12th, I called your office and talked to Christine about my concerns. When she called Mike Farquhar, he informed her that the survey had been done and it was in a closed-out file. After checking with the neighbors on Alma, English, and King Street, there seems to be a blockage or no proper drainage behind the houses on King Street on Highway 7, and backyards are flooded and the water stays in the yard. The house next to the drainage at Goddard's Ditch was in a foot of water until July. Does the City of Kawartha Lakes not have responsibility to correct this problem, or do I have to let my property go to swampland? I am a retired senior citizen and should not have to be dealing with this problem. Quick action now would alleviate further complications this winter for me and all of my neighbors. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Thank you. Thanks, Ms. Jackson. I appreciate that. Now, just for clarification, you have a claim in with the city regarding the culvert issue, correct? So we're going to deal with the culvert issue will be dealt with through the claim. We
Right.
won't give any direction on that because that's an active claim, obviously.
Right on.
But what I would suggest to council is we'll make a motion to review, to receive, and that staff review and report back ASAP on this flooding issue, if that's suitable for council. Councillor Ashmore, you're good with that? Okay, can I get a seconder? Councillor O'Reilly, are there any questions for the deputant? One of the issues here is that, we need to try to have a look at this as soon as possible so that it's not an issue in the spring, obviously. So I think this direction we give to staff will accomplish that. So there's no further questions? All in favor? That's passed. Thank you very much for coming today and sharing your concerns with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move into item 5.1, which is presentations. Our first presentation is regarding employment services transformation. Director of Human Services, Rod Sutherland. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And Council, I'm here this afternoon just to give Council a little bit of background and update on this project. Sorry, just wait for the. Sorry. Okay, so speaking regarding the province's employment services transformation. So in February of this year, February 2019, the provincial government announced that it is beginning work to transform Ontario's employment services system and to implement a new model to manage the system more effectively. Under this initiative, the transformation is looking to integrate employment programs currently under the Employment Ontario programs, Ontario Works, and the Ontario Disability Support Stream program into one new system. I'll give you the background in terms of the approach and the principles of the transformation. To start, the provincial vision for the new system is one that is locally responsive and community-based, outcome-focused, client-centered, provides simplified and effective pathways to find sustainable employment for both individuals and businesses, and that it will be led by the Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities. Currently, the integration, the transformation, I said, involves those three, the programs, the Employment Ontario and the Ontario Works and ODSP. Those programs are currently administered under the Ministry of Community, Children, Community and Social Services. But the new transformed system will be under MTCU. So in this spring, the province also announced that they were going to roll it out through a gradual implementation using 3 prototypes starting in this fall. The implementation will be rolled out provincially over the next several years, basically learning from the experience of the prototypes. And the 3 prototype regions were announced back in July. One being the Muskoka-Kawarthas. These regions highlighted on the map, the yellow is Muskoka-Kawarthas, are based on the federal economic regions. Those are the boundaries that were used for these prototypes. So we're within the Muskoka-Kawarthas, which includes six municipalities, or upper tiers, single tiers, being Kawartha Lakes, County of Haliburton, District of Muskoka, County of Peterborough, City of Peterborough, and Northumberland County. The other 2 prototypes, Peel Region, which is in itself the prototype, the municipality, the region, and the Hamilton Niagara Peninsula is the name of the other, which encompasses Niagara Region, Hamilton, Brant, and Haldimand, Norfolk. Our prototype region, as you can see, is quite a large area, covers just under 17,000 square kilometers, combined population of 378,000. And the overall, under our prototype region, the Muskoka-Kawarthas, for the new service system manager system, the annualized funding is approximately $22 million. So the current system in place right now, as I mentioned, is within this region. There are 4 consolidated municipal service managers, one of which is Kawartha Lakes, which delivers for Kawartha Lakes and Haliburton County for Ontario Works. Peterborough City is also the CMSM for Peterborough County, and then District of Muskoka and Northumberland County. So there's the 4 CMSMs that are delivering employment services under Ontario Works. There are currently 10 Employment Ontario service provider contracts within our region. So there's multiple agencies. There's actually less than 10 agencies, but some of them have more than one site, such as Fleming Crew has a contract for Haliburton County. It also has a separate contract for Peterborough. But there's currently 10 service provider contracts that are being part of this integration. And through ODSP, Employment Support Services, there are 10 service provider contracts within this region that are part of this consolidation within our prototype region. There are a few of Employment Ontario services that are currently delivered through them that are out of scope of this prototype, such as the literacy and basic skills is not part of the prototype. Second career, some of the grant-based programs, Canada Ontario Job Grant, apprenticeships, and the Skills Advance program. So those will still be administered, at least in the initial stages, outside of this new system. So as I mentioned, the new system is moving towards a service system manager approach. So the new service system managers are being established to plan and manage the system of employment services within the region. The service system manager is not necessarily a service provider. So there's service providers in effect, like in Kawartha Lakes, VCCS, Victoria County Career Services, is a Employment Ontario provider, Fleming Crew in Halliburton, but the service system manager is not necessarily a service provider. It will be managing the system across the entire region. And the employment service system managers are going to be selected using the provinces based on those best positioned to manage the system and deliver results within their regions. I just copied here, this is from the principles of the new system from the ministry around accountability and contestability, transparency, responsiveness, and efficiency of the new system. As well as highlights of the new system is moving to, again, from a consolidation transformation approach. The new system is moving to a single common assessment tool that will be used across the entire area. Right now, there's a multitude of assessments done either by individual agencies, providers, social assistance system, the employment system. Under the new system, there'll be one single common assessment tool that must be implemented across the region by all access points. So anybody coming into the system to use employment services, whether on social assistance, employment insurance, or any other person looking for employment, will go through the same process. As well, this integrated action plan becomes an action plan to support people through to employment. So right now, there's different components of plans, requirements under social assistance that differ for Ontario Works, ODSP, and Employment Ontario. These will become, again, standardized into an integrated action plan across those systems. And looking also as well in terms of increased coordination amongst between the social assistance system, employment system, in terms of the ultimate goal for both in terms of being employment. Consistency in data collection is another. Right now there's a number of different systems, computer programs, tracking systems that will all be standardized because the entire employment service system managed by one service system manager will be able to coordinate and work together on coordinate all the data for reporting. This just highlights in terms of the social assistance system and the employment services system, the interconnection. So employment services under the service system manager will be obviously employment focused. There's a number of factors built into the model in terms of performance-based funding, in terms of achieving targets based on the stream the person is in, which is based on how close to the labor market they are in terms of distance from the labor market, employment ready. On the social assistance side, the coordination is shifting away from the employment there, all the employment moving under the service system manager, that the social assistance will focus on life stabilization. The full details of this and actually a number of aspects of the system aren't fully known yet, but life stabilization through social assistance will be a piece of what we're doing now in social assistance, but is primarily focused on supporting people to get into a position in their life where they're then ready to move into the employment aspects. Similar to other programs, if people are dealing with housing insecurity, food insecurity, poverty, the broader social determinants of health, like those fields, that's in the life stabilization side. That will be the primary role on the social assistance side now in moving the employment work, specifically employment supports, into the broader service system management system. So as I mentioned, there's this new service system manager process. The identification and selection of the service system manager is a competitive process. Two-step process that started back in early summer with a request for qualification process. That closed in July. Those who were successful at that stage were then invited to complete through the call for proposals to submit a full proposal to the province by deadline is October 31st. This call for this selection process, competitive process, is open to any public, nonprofit, and private sector organizations, including consolidated municipal service managers and district social services boards. So at the request for proposal stage, a consortium, there's two ways, jumping back slightly to the qualifications. An agency or an entity could apply as an individual at that stage to qualify, or as a consortium. So a consortium was developed or came together of the municipalities of the District of Muskoka, Northumberland County, City of Peterborough, and Kawartha Lakes, as a consortium with City of Peterborough identified as the lead, and a request for qualification was submitted. This consortium was successful at phase 1 to qualify and has the ability to submit a full proposal to the ministry by October 31st. That process is now underway with the 4 municipalities, and as part of that consortium agreement, or consortium to do the full proposal, a formal consortium agreement of the 4 municipalities must be executed to be part of the proposal. So that consortium agreement, which is an intermunicipal agreement between Kawartha Lakes, Muskoka, Peterborough City, and Northumberland County, is currently in review. There's a number of principles of that consortium agreement. This service system manager role is 100% funded by the province. There's a number of qualifying things within the consortium agreement that from the municipalities need to ensure. It primarily is no municipal cost. This is delivering on behalf of the province, potentially. It is not a cost to the municipal taxpayer. It is 100% funded through the Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities. And the assurances that must be in place for this to be executed or considered to be executed by each of the 4 municipalities is that there's no municipal cost to it. The other primary principles in terms of the municipal approaches is that it will be locally driven and community focused and based on the needs of each individual community and all the communities within our prototype region. I note that at that first qualifying stage, the ministry did provide the results, and there were a total of 17 qualifying entities at that qualifying stage. They did not identify, of those 17, what regions. You could apply for multiple regions to qualify for, and ultimately anybody who succeeded or qualified at step 1 can apply for any or all 3 of the prototype regions at this next step, but ultimately can only be chosen for one. So an entity could apply to be the lead, the service system manager in Muskoka Kawarthas, Peel, and Niagara. But if chosen, you can only deliver in one, they have said. Our consortium is only applying for Muskoka Kawarthas. Of the 17 who qualified, again, they didn't identify which region they're for. There's a total of 4 municipalities or consortiums. 1 public entity and 7 nonprofits and 5 for-profit organizations that qualified at that step. The for-profits, is an interesting different approach, includes entities from Ontario, British Columbia, 2 I believe from the United States and 1 from Australia. So the schedule in terms of, as mentioned, in terms of the proposals, October 31st is the deadline for submission of the proposals. The ministry has said that evaluations will be completed into November with negotiation and execution of funding agreements following a successful negotiation with the successful proponents between November and January. The initial, for the prototype, they've identified that the prototype will be for a 3-year term with options for 2 one-year extensions. So the prototype phases, again, whoever the successful service system manager proponent is, between January and March of next year is the planning period, where they'll work with the ministry fine-tuning a number of aspects. There's a lot of information we still don't know, even though we're 3 weeks out from the deadline. There's components that haven't been finalized yet, that haven't been communicated out to any of the proponents. It may not even come out until afterwards. So there'll be a time for that planning period to identify and work with that information. There's a transition period, a 6-month transition period from April to September. So starting April 1st, the successful service system manager will assume all existing contracts from the ministry for the existing system, which is all the existing Employment Ontario contracts and ODSP employment supports contracts, that they will manage with provincial funds for those 6 months. But during that 6 months, the changes cannot be made to those contracts, but as a transition in terms of how those will be managed leading up to October 1st, 2020, which is the implementation of the full delivery model, or full integrated delivery model, which incorporates all the funding from Ontario Works Employment Supports, ODSP Employment Supports, and the full Employment Ontario system. So during that transition period, the successful service system manager would have that time to plan what, who, and how delivery would be in place by October 1st of next year. With the, on the Ontario Works side, ODSP as well, but from the municipal standpoint, as the delivery agent for the Ontario Works right now, October 1st next year is the transfer of the funding that we currently receive for those employment supports through Ontario Works will be ending as of the end of next September. We'll only receive that funding for the first 3 quarters, and effective October 1st next year, that funding that we're receiving now will be integrated into this new system. So this is one of the things we don't know what the impact is going to be. That is with or without, regardless of who the service system manager is on the Ontario Works side, we know that funding is going to change because it will be consolidated within this program effective next October, no matter who the service system manager is. With that, I will
We're not getting
ask
a
if there's any
we're not getting
questions.
we're not getting a quiz on this later or anything, are we?
You have to be able to say service system manager very quickly, about 100 times.
Thanks for that. Councillor Helmsley, I believe you have a motion? No?
That was for the other,
That's for the other one?
that's for later
Oh,
on.
I'm sorry, sir.
This is just,
I'm just anxious to get your motion. Hey? Motion to receive. Councillor Seymour Fagan and Councillor Richardson. Any questions for the deputant? Councillor Riley?
Just a quick one. You touched on service system managers and where they, would you have a speculation or a guess who might typically be some people that would, I know you touched on it, but who might be people that would be in position to take those positions?
so for other proponents or other applicants
No, for the service system managers itself.
for that role?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, so our consortium of the 4
Yeah.
municipalities is going to be submitting a proposal
Yeah.
to be that service system manager, the consortium of our 4 municipalities. The others who qualify, like I said, there's a list of 17 entities. They're from, again, private. Some of them are currently private sector employment service providers.
Did you mention Australia as well?
There's one company from Australia, International APM. These are posted on the ministry's website. International APM Group Limited.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with them. I know Australia's system, employment services system, I've heard is totally run private sector, their employment sector. There's a consortium of local within our region, the Muskoka Kawarthas region, there's a consortium of, I think it's six current service providers, smaller agencies that have a consortium they're applying. Fleming College has qualified
That's good.
within this region.
That's good. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So, Director, I mean, this is fairly confusing, but what's changing from the way this service is delivered now? What's the rationale for doing these prototypes? I mean, there's obviously a reason the province wants to look at this and put these in place. So the way the service is being delivered now, how is it?
So,
Just
yeah,
briefly.
in essence, right now, it's they're looking from the integration and consolidated approach. There's currently, in essence, 24 different either entities, agencies delivering the whole suite of services. It crosses from social assistance to nonprofit agencies, service providers, some specific on the ODSP side to persons with disabilities, some for focus more on, not on social assistance, more employment-ready people in the community who might be on EI or just job searching. It's pulling those together to better coordinate and integrate them. As I mentioned, there's different computer systems there's reporting on, there's different outcomes that are reporting on, and multiple, say, in terms of the principles, they're looking at multiple redundancies in essence in terms of the different approaches, trying to look at an integrated approach from a streamlined, more responsive, as opposed to gaps, people being from one stream have to be referred to a different one, in essence, starting over or sort of being reassessed there on different criteria. So one common assessment, so everybody's approaching it from the same goal with the expected outcomes and approach at the end being similar in terms of those employment outcomes.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? We have a motion to receive. All in favor? That's passed. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, we'll move into item 5.2, which is the draft development charges background study findings. Adam Found, our manager of corporate assets. Carl Repka is here, a member of the development charges task force. And Sean Michael Stephen, our senior project coordinator from Watson and Associates. Welcome, gentlemen. Go ahead.
Is it on now? There we go. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So in the interest of time, I'm going to be very brief, just to give some introductory remarks. As council is aware, we're in the middle of the process of updating our DC bylaw, and that involves undertaking a very long and complicated DC background study, for which we've retained Watson and Associates. I have a memo on the agenda which more or less explains the process, where we're at in the process, and where we anticipate going for the balance of the process. So with that said, I'll turn things over to Carl Repka, who is a member of the DC Task Force, who has a few remarks to share with council about how that part of the process has gone and where we anticipate it going in the near future. And then after him will be Sean Michael Stephen for Watson and Associates.
Thanks, Adam, and hello, Council and Mr. Mayor. I've been asked to provide a brief overview of the task force's work to date. We've been meeting approximately every 3 weeks since January to generally follow the process of the city and Watson and Associates work on the background study in the new DC bylaw. Sort of the first stage was a bit of an onboarding educational piece and gathering inputs. The task force has actively sought input from the development community, specifically the Peterborough and Kawartha Home Builders Association. Members of the task force are sort of in the development industry as well, trying to channel in and bring in some input from people that would be affected by the bylaw. General, just a little anecdotally, some of the feedback that was received from the Home Builders Association, specifically on the residential DCs, was that they just thought that as of the 2015 bylaw, the current rates are generally fair. So there was not really a big complaint on the residential side of current rates. So that was just a nice piece of feedback for the city. We also received deputations at our meetings from various stakeholders, including some local developers, even the economic development department of the city, some agricultural industry stakeholders, and some self-storage applicants that had some concerns with development charges. When we were considering recommendations, I'd say there's probably two guiding principles that we were trying to balance. One is providing an incentive to development. That was paramount, and then that was part of your council's mandate to our task force. The second was often reminded to us from staff, but it's also just not overburdening the taxpayer. And one important thing we did learn was that the DC Act requires that any exemptions you give on DC's development charges to applicants as they come in have to be replenished from ratepayer sources. So it's something that we were cognizant of in sort of the first version of recommendations. Also, just sort of to help with that, not overburdening the taxpayer, many of the administrative recommendations that you'll see, there's a list of, I think, 27 total, and about half of them are administrative. I would say that most of those originated with staff, but the task force was generally supportive of them because they bring some transparency to the cost of any DC defrayals or sort of cost benefits or incentives, if you want to think of them that way. But we would urge council not to view these as a cost, but just that the financial impact of any DC exemptions, being transparent through council, just that you view them as an investment in development and an investment in the community. I'm just going to highlight 3 of what we thought were some of the important recommendations out of the 27. The first was looking at a uniform rate for commercial and industrial. Typically, the industrial use is lighter and would require a lower development charge. Commercial has a greater impact on services, and the rate is higher. If you kind of level the playing field and average them out, the commercial rate comes down and the industrial rate goes up. It's a way of providing an incentive mostly on the commercial side, but at no impact to the ratepayer, to the taxpayer. And so we thought that was a low-hanging fruit to make sure we go with a uniform rate. It provides some incentive to the commercial ratepayer or the commercial DC charge without impacting or having to replenish it from a tax source. We also had a lot of really positive feedback from the development community on the current DC deferral policy, which applies to residential developers. They're allowed to defer payment until, sometimes even up to occupancy for up to 3 years. That really helps them match cash flow. A lot of urging for us to keep that program, and we are. That's a strong recommendation. That deferral policy is being expanded. Bill 108 is going to require, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that from Watson, but there's going to be a lot of updates to this current study. It's sort of an interim one before Bill 108 takes full effect. But all of the non-residential deferrals that are required in Bill 108, we're actually trying to move those forward now because we're going in that direction. We might as well do it. We might as well do it early. And the last is you will see that there is an increase in rates, and Watson and I'm sure staff can give you backgrounds on why the rates go up whenever you do a DC background study. They have a jump that's more than just indexing for inflation. And to soften that, we are making a recommendation that there be some sort of phase-in. Well, I guess it's not called a phase-in, but an opportunity for grandfathering. People who are in the pipeline right now that aren't expecting that hit of 20-25% increase in their rates, that they can enter into an agreement before this bylaw comes into place and pay on the 2019 rates, just to soften the blow of the new rates. The current list of recommendations should be seen as a version 1.0. The term of the task force has been extended by council, we understand. So thanks, I'll have to give up a few more Friday mornings. The next phase of the task force mandate is to continue with the expansion of the DC assistance policy as a version 2.0. I think that there's still lots left on the table to do in terms of incentivizing development. What we hope to do is gather those inputs with the help of Watson, give you a clear picture of what the price of that investment would be, and you let council decide what's the best value. So thanks so much. I'll leave it to Watson.
Did they extend your pay, Carl, along with the contract when they put it through?
Occasionally there's free coffee, so.
Perfect.
Hello. So the intent of my presentation today will be to obviously review the draft findings of the development charge background study that was issued yesterday, and as well to talk about the development charge bylaw implementation considerations and a couple of specific areas where we're looking for some council direction around the development charge assistance policy that's been developed by staff, and as well as on the non-residential structure of the charge that Carl spoke to, being the uniform charge versus the current non-residential development charge structure that the city has. So largely by way of introduction, obviously development charges are under the authority of the Development Charges Act, and they are a mechanism available to municipalities to recover the growth-related costs of new development. And these growth-related costs that we're referring to are typically those with broader system benefits. They not include those local services that would be placed by a developer as a condition of development agreement, such as local roads or water mains. So to touch on the methodology that's prescribed by the Act briefly, I think it's helpful at this stage to do so. That the first step is to understand what the anticipated development is, because development charges obviously are a mechanism to recover the growth rate costs of that anticipated development, looking at the type, amount, and location of that development. We then need to estimate what the increase in need for service is. When doing that, we have to regard for certain services that are ineligible under the Act, largely being arts, tourism, museum, culture, and general governance facilities. And when doing that as well, there are a couple important tests that need to be met. One is we have to have regard for the average level of service that was in place in the municipality historically. And as well, there needs to be a council intention that an increase in need for service will be met. Having established what those needs are, in the 4 yellow boxes, there's 4 main deductions that need to be made from those capital costs, one being for any uncommitted excess capacity. So an example of that would be if you have a water treatment plant that was built 40 years ago and has excess capacity to serve future development, you cannot recover that excess capacity that remains from new development. You need to deduct any costs that are related to the benefit to existing development. That's typically the most significant deduction that we see in development charge background studies. You need to have regard for any other grants, subsidies, or contributions that are anticipated towards those projects, and as well for what the Act calls soft services, so principally parks and recreation and library, there needs to be a further 10% deduction made as well. Having arrived at those then net growth-related costs, there can be municipal-wide versus area-specific considerations, additional financing costs that are included. Then having calculated the charge, there's a number of bylaw implementation considerations for council as well. And so before we progress any further, I just want to touch on the status of Bill 108, just so council is aware of the proposed changes and where that stands in terms of the development charge background study that's been prepared and the bylaw that's proposed to go forward to council. So Bill 108 did receive royal assent on May 2nd of this year, however, on June 6th of this year. However, the majority of the changes that relate to Development Charges Act and Schedule 3 of Bill 108 have not yet come into force, but will do so upon proclamation, which is currently anticipated to be January 1st of 2020, with a 1-year transition date until January 1st, 2021 for those for municipalities to align with those recommended or those proposed changes. The main aspects of the Development Charges Act that have been amended and are enforced generally relate to transitional provisions around soft services within existing development charge bylaws and how those would be transitioned to a community benefits charge under the Planning Act. So to highlight those changes that are proposed to take place. So the first one is that what the Act calls soft services will be removed from the Development Charges Act authority and will be then form part of a community benefits charge under the Planning Act. So essentially what this is doing is changing the definition of, or changing how the Act describes eligible services, where right now it only defines what are the ineligible services, and it will now change that to define only what are the eligible services. And so those services that will remain will be water and wastewater, roads, stormwater, police, fire, ambulance, waste diversion, and transit. And so what that would mean is that services that are currently in your bylaw, such as Parks and Rec, library, housing, airport, bylaw enforcement, which is proposed to be included in parking, would no longer be eligible and would become part of a community benefits charge bylaw. And then for waste diversion and ambulance, which would remain in the development charge authority, they would no longer have the statutory 10% deduction applied. The next change around the determination of the DC has to do with when development charges are calculated and when they would be payable. So the default mechanism right now under the Development Charges Act is that development charges are calculated and payable at the time of building permit issuance. What is proposed in Bill 108 is that for developments that proceed through site plan or zoning bylaw amendment applications, that charge would be calculated at the time that application is made, and would be frozen for what is proposed currently to be a maximum period of 2 years from the approval of the application until building permit issuance. So potentially creating some additional cash flow and financing considerations for municipalities, as well as additional administrative responsibilities to track those developments as they move through the approvals process. And then for all other developments or applications that don't go through those planning processes, development charges would remain payable or calculated and payable at the time of building permit issuance. For the payment in installments, so right now, under the Development Charges Act, municipalities can allow development charges to be paid before or after the otherwise would be payable under Section 27 of the Act. What Bill 108 proposes is that for rental housing, commercial, industrial, and institutional developments, they would be required to pay their charges in 6 equal annual installments, again creating some additional cash flow considerations for municipalities. And then for nonprofit housing, that deferral period, mandatory deferral period, would be extended to 21 equal annual installments. And then lastly, around exemptions. So the Development Charges Act does include some mandatory statutory exemptions that are included in the Act. Right now, there's exemptions for the creation of additional residential dwelling units or secondary dwelling units within existing residential buildings. You can create up to 2 additional dwelling units and they would be exempt from development charges. What is proposed is that provision would be extended to not only new dwelling units within existing buildings, but as well within newly created buildings, as well as in ancillary detached structures as well, such as coach houses or garages. So to touch on the growth forecast that's been developed for this development charge background study, the sources are there before you, where we're still looking at the approved growth to 2031, as the city has not yet updated its growth management strategy to align with the provincial growth target of 2041. And I think as it was mentioned, this is being done at this point because that process that the city will be going through to update that growth management strategy and then the subsequent master plans and service strategies to align with that growth will not be finalized until the expiry of the current bylaw in November of next year. And so this process is being undertaken at this time to start to recover some of those additional pressures on the Development Charge Reserve Fund. So in terms of the residential growth forecast, the population is presented including permanent population and a 50% attribution of seasonal growth, consistent with the current approach in your development charge background study and bylaw. That would see the city growing by about 20,500 people over the period from 2019 to 31, and about 2/3 of that growth occurring in the urban service area of Lindsay. In terms of non-residential development, it's been allocated here in terms of the land-based employment sectors of industrial, commercial, and institutional. Over the period of 2031, it's anticipated there'll be about a 3,036 job increase in the employment sector across the city. That will be about 64% of that in the commercial sector, with the remaining employment increase being split somewhat evenly between institutional and industrial. When we look at where that employment increase is located geographically, about 98% of it is anticipated to be in the urban service areas, with about 76% in Lindsay and 22% in the other urban service areas of the city. So the services that are being considered for inclusion in the background study and bylaw include what the Act calls the soft services over the 10-year period, which is the maximum period that they can be assessed for, including parking, airport, parks and recreation, library, administration, municipal bylaw enforcement, paramedic services, health and social services, including social housing, as well as waste diversion. Transit services are considered over the 10-year period, but only within Lindsay, as that's the service area to which those services are being provided. And then similarly for police, they're being assessed in the areas of Lindsay and the Township of Ops within that defined service area. Roads and related and fire services have been assessed over a longer term period to 2031. And similarly for the urban services of water and wastewater have also been assessed over the period to 2031 within those urban service areas. And notably consistent with Council's policy, wastewater collection is being assessed in the urban service areas outside of the Northwest Development Area of Lindsay, because those costs of the growth-related infrastructure are being recovered through a Municipal Act capital charge. So the detail around these costs are included in the development charge background study, but across all those services we just mentioned, there's about $446 million in gross capital costs that have been identified. About 40% of those have been deducted as a benefit to existing development, with a further 11% or $51 million be deducted as a post-period benefit. What these costs are for post-period benefit are costs that are growth-related and could potentially be included in a future development charge background study, but are for the needs of development outside the respective forecast period. So for example, where we have a fire master plan that assesses the needs over the period of 2041, a portion of that benefit for growth between 2031 and 41 has been deducted as a post-period benefit. Smaller deductions for the miscellaneous deductions as well as grant subsidies and a 10% deduction have been made, resulting in $215 million in potential DC recoverable costs being included in the calculation of the charge. And within that $215 million, that includes about $8 million as an estimated DC reserve fund deficit that currently needs to be funded from future growth. So to look at how that development charge recoverable cost of $215 million breaks down by service, well, those pie charts, it's quite busy. What you will notice is that the 5 largest blocks or wedges of the pie are for roads and related service, as well as the water and wastewater services, showing that about 89% of the total DC recoverable costs are for those hard services of roads, water, and wastewater services, with only about 11% of that total cost being for those other services within the city. So the schedule of residential charges is the maximum charge that could be imposed by council based on the calculations. And how the charges are presented here is by individual service and as well as aggregated by dwelling unit type, where the charges are first calculated on a per capita basis and then converted to a per dwelling unit charge based on the underlying occupancy assumptions of the different dwelling units based on census data. And so we'd see the highest charge for single and semi-attached dwelling units in the urban Lindsay area of $25,400, decreasing down to $11,484 for bachelor and 1-bedroom apartments. The 5 subtotals at the bottom reflect the respective development areas within the city to which these charges will apply based on the underlying service area. So within the urban Lindsay area, that would be all services would apply. Within the urban Northwest Trunk area, that would be all charges other than wastewater collection. And then urban other reflects urban serviced areas outside of Lindsay where police and transit charges do not apply. And then we have rural ops and rural other because in the former township of Ops, the police charge would apply, while in the other rural areas, it would be the non-urban or transit and police services. In terms of the non-residential charges, so the table here presents the charges based on their current structure, which is to calculate the charges on a differentiated basis for industrial, commercial, and institutional development. And that differentiation is done based on the underlying density of development. So where industrial development typically would develop at a lower density than commercial institutional, we see a lower charge based on their per employee demands for service. And then the other structure that's presented is what is titled here as a uniform charge, and that's an average cost calculation, looking at what would the charge be on an average cost basis for all types of non-residential development, as opposed to that differentiated approach. And so, as was mentioned, this is one of the areas where we are looking for direction from council in terms of bringing this bylaw forward at the public meeting and then for council's consideration for passage is the desired structure. As was identified, staff and the task force recommendation is to move from the differentiated approach to having an average cost uniform approach to the non-residential charge calculation. What you'll see with that is that based on the calculated charges for the current approach is that the industrial charge would be about $105 per square meter, commercial would be at $250 per square meter, institutional $179 per square meter. Moving that to a uniform calculation would show that that would be $191 per square meter for all three sectors of non-residential development. And so that would show about an 81% increase for industrial compared to the differentiated calculation, but a 23% decrease for commercial compared to the differentiated calculation, and about a 7% increase for institutional. And so if council does provide direction to move forward with the uniform charge, what staff is proposing is that there would be a further 50% reduction to the industrial charge to mitigate the significant increase in the industrial charge from moving to this uniform calculation. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as we look at these impacts further. So with the residential charge, the charge has increased in all areas except for the Northwest Development Area by between about 24 and 28%. The increase in terms of percentage basis is slightly higher in the Northwest Trunk because the increase in the wastewater collection charge was a relatively nominal amount where it didn't move very much. So on a percentage basis, their charge is increasing at a greater amount. But as we see in terms of the overall amount of the charge, it's generally consistent with the other urban serviced areas at around $5,100, $5,200. For the non-residential charge, the summary of the charges is presented here for the different development areas, and it's shown for that increase over the current charges using the differentiated calculation on the left-hand side versus the uniform calculation on the right-hand side. And so, again, with the differentiated calculation in the urban serviced areas, we'd see about an 18% increase for industrial, and then similarly increases for commercial and institutional, between 21 and 23% increases when using the differentiated charge. When using a uniform charge, where it would be $191 in Lindsay, $139 in the Northwest Development Area, and $186 in other urban serviced areas. For industrial development, again, we would see about 111, 114% increase in the charge. Again, that's really the driving factor for then wanting the city proposing to have a 50% reduction in that charge if this approach is to be utilized. But then for commercial development, we would actually see in the urban serviced areas between a 5 and 7% decrease in the charge, and much more significant in the rural areas between 18 and 19%, and then an increase for institutional between 29 and 32% in the urban serviced areas using the recommended uniform approach. So to look at these a little bit further in terms of how they compare to your neighbors from a competitiveness standpoint, the charges are presented for your neighboring municipalities, including not only the lower tier development charges, but as well as the upper tier, so region or county charges, as well as education development charges where they apply. The gray arrows represent the current charges in the 5 development areas, and the blue arrows represent what the fully calculated charge would be. Within the urban serviced areas, we see of Lindsay and then outside of Lindsay, about a 26% increase in the charge would move the municipality in terms of its its competitive position from that comparable to Selwyn and Orillia to slightly above that, but still below the proposed charges for Peterborough, and then the charges in Orangeville and Cavan-Monaghan as well. And then the charges in the rural service areas, because they don't include the water and wastewater charges, would position the city at the bottom end of the comparison. In terms of the non-residential comparisons, what you'll see here is that in addition to the blue and gray arrows, there's also some red stars that are on this graph. And what that identifies is where the city would move to if they impose the uniform calculation. And so with development in Lindsay or outside of Lindsay, well, there would be about a 23% increase in the charge using your current differentiated non-residential charge structure. That would move the city above that of Brock and Uxbridge. If they actually utilize the uniform approach, there'd be between a 5 and 7% decrease, not materially changing the position of the city relative to its comparators. And again, with the rural charges, again, no significant change in the competitive position. In terms of industrial, as we saw with that 100+% increase in the charge going to the uniform calculation, that could potentially see the urban service areas moving up to the upper end of this comparison, above that of the Durham region municipalities. But if the uniform approach is undertaken, what is proposed is there would be a 50% reduction to that charge. And so with that 50% reduction, the city's current industrial charges would increase only by about 7%. Again, not changing the current position of where the city would rank relative to its competitors. Again, just above that of Aurelia, but below the Durham region municipalities. And in terms of institutional, there'd be about a 7% increase in the current charge, or sorry, about 23% increase in the current charge when moving to this uniform calculated rate, and not a significant change versus the differentiated rate. So to touch on the bylaw policies that are either statutorily required or for council's consideration. So as you mentioned, there is the development charge assistance policy that's being brought forward to council by staff, and the intent of the policy is to address and provide guidelines in terms of the implementation of the development charge deferrals, as well as the potential extensions for the eligibility of development charge credits. And this approach is being utilized to provide the city with some flexibility to monitor the effectiveness of these policies and to change them as they may feel is required in the future. So under the Development Charges Act, as I mentioned, the default mechanism is that development charges are payable and calculated at the time of building permit issuance, but municipalities may also require hard services like roads, water, and wastewater to be payable at the time of subdivision registration. And you also do have within your authority the ability to allow applicants to pay their charges either before or after they otherwise would be payable. And because they are applicable law, you're not required to issue a building permit until development charges are paid. So the proposed policies, which are largely consistent with your current policies, is that you'd retain the ability to require roads, water, and wastewater services to be paid at the time of subdivision or consent agreement, and that all other development charges would be payable at building permit issuance. And then the development charge deferral policies, which would be included in the city's development charge assistance policy, are largely consistent with your current deferral policies, including a deferral of condominium of DCs until condominium registration or occupancy, deferrals for high density development where 50% would be payable 1.5 years after agreement and 50% 3 years from agreement, deferral to occupancy for residential development, and then for non-residential development, there'd be up to a maximum 3-year deferral from the time of agreement. Sorry, about to flip ahead there. In terms of development charge exemptions, so as I mentioned, some are statutorily required. But then there's others that are at council's discretion to include as defined in the bylaw. The exemptions within development charge bylaws can typically be included into 4 groups. So whether that be by use for places of worship or farm buildings, for example, by geographic area, by development type, so potentially 50% reduction for industrial development, and by individual service within the bylaw as well. What the Act is quite clear in is that you may not impose a higher charge on one type of development as a result of imposing a lower charge on another. And so the result of that is that if you are providing any exemptions through your bylaw, the revenue foregone as a result of those exemptions needs to be contributed to the Development Charge Reserve Fund from a non-DC source, such as taxes or rates. So the statutory exemptions that are currently included in the Act include that any existing industrial buildings may expand up to 50% of their gross floor area without the payment of development charges. For residential intensification, single detached homes, existing single detached homes may add up to 2 apartment units within or attached to the existing dwelling unit, as long as the size of the home doesn't double. And then for other types of residential dwelling units, they can add up to 1 additional apartment unit within the structure, again without the payment of development charges. And you do not impose DCs on yourselves or other levels of municipal governments or school boards. Non-statutory exemptions that are proposed include places of worship, nonprofit hospice, public hospitals, cemeteries, burial sites or crematoriums. Agricultural development would also be exempt. Park model trailers would be exempt, as well as municipal housing dwelling units. And then if the uniform non-residential charge structure is utilized, there would also be a 50% reduction for all new industrial development. Redevelopment credits are currently provided in your bylaw, and although these are not required by the Development Charges Act, they are provided by case law and as an industry best practice. What the intent of a redevelopment credit is to do is that where you have an existing building or structure that has a defined level of service, if you demolish and replace that building or convert it to another use, there is no increase in need for service as a result of replacing what was already there. And so practically how that works, if you have a single family home and you demolish and replace it with a single family home, you have a development charge payable for that single family home, and you get a credit for what was demolished being the same dwelling unit type, and there'd be no charge payable. If you replace a single family home with a 6-unit townhouse, you would pay the charge on the 6-unit townhome and have a credit for the single family home that was replaced. And so what you would pay would be the difference. Your current policy, which is proposed to be maintained, is that there would be a maximum 3-year period between demolition of an existing structure and the redevelopment of that, for which the development charge credit would be available to the applicant. And what's proposed in the development charge assistance policy is that that 3-year period could be extended for a maximum further 3 years, where there's been a commitment to redeveloping in a timely manner. And then where in council determination, there's a derelict building that shall be demolished in the public's interest, there could be up to a further 7-year extension period for which that redevelopment credit would be witnessed, for a maximum total of 10 years. Development Charges Act allows for indexing of the charge on an annual basis. That can be done on a mandatory or discretionary basis. It's currently undertaken on a mandatory basis by staff on January 1st of each year, and that policy is proposed to be maintained. So in terms of the next steps in this development charge process, the first would be to receive direction from council on the non-residential charge and the development charge assistance policy, so that can be brought forward into the background study and proposed bylaw that will come forward to council and the public at a development charge public meeting on November 5th, and then to council for consideration of the bylaw on December 10th, with the anticipated effective date being January 1st, 2020. Happy to take any questions there may be.
Thank you. We got a motion to receive. Councillor Elmsley and Dunn. Councillor Elmsley, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I have a couple. Thank you for coming, all of you. Just a couple of things. Getting back to municipal housing or affordable housing. I believe within our official plan, we state that developers will put aside 10% of their housing, of any new development for affordable housing. Does that play any part in the development charges bylaw?
In terms of the payment of development charges on those units?
Exactly.
Yes, so right now, the way your bylaw has been drafted is that there would be development charges payable on all those units unless they are a municipal housing unit.
So that, if we wanted to, I'm talking about the Halliburton Kawartha Housing Corporation, which has a very aggressive target for providing affordable housing over the next 10 years. And one of the ways it's envisioned doing that is not only through secondary suites, but also through incentivizing developers through maybe the waiving of development charges and other permits or fees. And if I'm hearing you correctly, if we do that, it has to be made up in some other way?
That's correct.
So on the general tax rate, or how would that work?
So practically, how that may work is that the amount of those exemptions from whatever individual exemption it may be from should be tracked annually and then funded to the Development Charge Reserve Fund to make it whole from either a non-development charge reserve, such as a tax-based reserve or a rate-based reserve.
If it was included in the development charges bylaw, would that still be the case?
If the exemption was included?
Yes.
Yes,
It would still be the case?
yes.
Okay. Talking about the removal of soft costs from the Act and those being charged extra, if we are removing the soft costs and we still have a 26% increase, and I know it's 36% or 35% on other things, and 111% if we take another scenario, how do we recover those soft costs? And is that not an additional cost of development?
Yes, so what is currently proposed under Bill 108 is that for those soft services, those costs would no longer, or those services would no longer be eligible, so the component of the charge that's made up from those services would be removed. In terms of how you would recover those growth-related costs, what's proposed is that they could potentially be included in a community benefits charge bylaw under the Planning Act. And so this new community benefits charge regime would be a charge that would include not only these former soft costs under the Development Charges Act, but they'd also include your costs associated with cash in lieu of parkland or parkland dedication, as well as Section 37 density bonusing under the Planning Act. The draft regulation has been released for community benefits charge bylaw. However, there's still a lot of unanswered questions in terms of how that charge will be formulated and the potential revenue impacts on municipalities. Because what is proposed is that that charge would be a maximum charge related to a prescribed percentage of land value. And so depending on what prescribed percentage the council arrives, or the province arrives at, could impact your cost recovery compared to your current revenue sources.
Did I hear you correctly that it could be parkland? That it could be offset by the giving of parkland or cash in lieu of parkland?
It's not that it would be offset, it's that right now where you have three essential revenue sources available to you, those being the Development Charges Act for soft services, cash in lieu of parkland, and Section 37 density bonusing. What the community benefits charge bylaw will do is it will take those three sources and combine them into one charge under a community benefits charge, and that charge will be up to a maximum percentage of land value. And so compared to the revenue you currently get from those three sources, it could be constrained.
And who would pay that cost?
Developers would.
The developer
It
would?
would be payable
So
on the day before building permit issuance.
So it's not envisioned that would go on the general tax rate or be an addition to the general tax rate?
Yeah, so if the community benefits regime results in less revenue being collected than under the current mechanisms available to you, then that shortfall would presumably go to taxes.
One other thing that occurs to me, I believe I heard it said that if somebody got into the queue now before the new development charges bylaw was passed, that they would get the current charges and not the new charges. And I'm just wondering if there has been any consideration to what that might do to our planning department and our building department in terms of the number of applications and their ability to handle it.
So I guess two things. On the second part first, no, there has not been any assessment of the potential uplift in development activity and what that might mean in terms of your administrative ability to process that. Secondly, that recommendation from the task force to potentially grandfather in developments that are currently in the process has not yet been considered in the background study or bylaw that's been proposed. However, at council's direction, that can be done as both documents can be amended up until the proposed date for bylaw passage in December. So if those are policies that council wishes to consider, they can still be included.
Thank you for that. One other question came up some time ago about development charges on storage units. And I believe they're lumped into either commercial or industrial, and of course they're hollow shells, and it seems unfair to charge them the same amount. Has there been consideration made to handling those as one-offs or within another portion of the bylaw?
Yeah, so how those have been proposed to be addressed at this point is that moving towards because they're currently considered commercial and therefore charge the highest non-residential rate you have. And so how that is being addressed is that moving towards the uniform calculation would see a decrease in their development charge payable, as although they would still be considered commercial, all non-residential development would pay the same charge.
And maybe my last question. When you talk about phasing in the new development charges, would that be done equally over, I'm assuming it would be 5 years, because we have to do a new bylaw in 5 years, or at least look at it, or 10 years. Is it to be done equally, or is it to be, 10% the first year, 10% the second year, and then in the third year it would go to the full? How is it envisioned to phase that in?
So at this point, there has been no phase-in provision, but to the extent council wishes to either phase in or impose a charge lower than otherwise calculated, it's within your powers to do so, and that can be structured in quite a number of ways. So common approaches are to phase it in 5 equal annual installments. Some municipalities elect to go with essentially an extension of the current charges, so they might defer the increase for a 6-month period, and then increase to the full rate at that time. It can really be structured in any number of ways through the bylaw to meet what are the intentions of doing that.
And the cost for water and wastewater is generally goes to the users of water and wastewater. But in the development process, they have to pay the cost for water and wastewater at time of subdivision agreement, or?
So within the bylaw, the city has the ability to require applicants to pay those charges at the time of building permit, or at the time of subdivision or consent agreement. But within your proposed deferral policies, that for residential development, those could then be deferred to occupancy.
And if we did that, would it then fall upon the users of water and wastewater to pick up that cost?
No, it would still be paid by the building permit applicant.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you. Councillor Dunn?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple of quick questions. Page 17, when you're talking about the differential rate and the uniform rates, and I'm just going to pick one because it can probably answer most of my questions. Now, what I understood the proposal is that if we go to the uniform rates, that $101, and I'm just going to pick the top line for industrial, okay? Because it's just conversation. It goes to $101.75, and the proposal is to charge them the $101 and then give them a 50% rebate.
So the way the table is laid out, the current charge is $89.
Yep.
The calculated charge is $191, and the increase is 114% or $101.
Yep.
Right. So
Okay.
they wouldn't be charged the $101; they'd be charged the $191.
Okay. All right. That's fine.
And to your point, yes, what's proposed is that there would be a 50% reduction applied to the $191.
Okay. So what my question is, who pays for the 50% reduction?
Tax and rate base.
Tax rate. So we're now going to, if we actually go down that route, we would be, the taxpayers would be paying for the industrial development charges, 50% of it, 50% of the increase, or 50% of the difference, however you want to say that.
Yeah. Yes.
It's going to come out of the taxpayer's pocket as opposed to the person that's making money from the development.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Got it? Councillor Riley?
Yeah, maybe just to clarify with Ron and with Adam, there's going to be a presentation, is there not, to council on the development charges, which may answer a lot of the questions. Is that not proposed?
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, that is proposed. So as council is aware now, we do have a public meeting scheduled for November 5th.
Yeah.
So that's an opportunity not just for, I guess, staff and council to discuss the proposed DC bylaw and the study, but also for the public and for developers to come in and also make their representations as well. So there'll be plenty of time during that public meeting for those discussions. And also, my understanding is that staff is endeavoring to bring a report to council, hopefully on the 22nd, to bring forward a number of the provisions that Sean Michael was referring to in terms of the whether a differentiated rate or a uniform rate should be applied, whether there should be a 50% reduction on industrial if that is applied, and then a couple of other measures where we would be looking to get some direction from council on before we have that public meeting. Otherwise, we would look for that direction at the public meeting.
Just a couple, another question is, there's been a lot of rumors this week out there, actually when the actual numbers come out, what the real increases are. So is there going to be something go out, even though this is public information, there seems to be some misinformation out there as well. Maybe you've heard about it as well too.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, I too heard, I believe, some of that misinformation about percentage increases that were quite a bit higher than what is being shown here. Certainly, the study, the proposed bylaw, the proposed policy are all now public. They're all online. And so everybody can look at them to get the real numbers, which are reflected here in this presentation.
And just finally, even though we're going through this exercise and we have to have a bylaw passed at the end of the year, we don't really know what the true impacts of 108 are going to be, which is kind of a catch-22 situation, because we got to get our bylaw in place by the end of this year. We got to get it going, and then we don't really know what the true impacts of 108 are. So it's a bit of a situation that Sean has explained there earlier.
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor, that's correct. We don't know yet what the full effect of Bill 108 will be, and that's part the reason why we recommended that council extend the term of the DC task force, so that we can take a closer look at Bill 108 and hopefully come up with the best way possible for the city to manage those changes. And your point about trying to get a DC bylaw in place as soon as possible is well taken, because as council is aware that the reserve is under quite a bit of pressure right now, the DC reserve is, and we're trying to make sure that we minimize that pressure as much as possible. And one important way of doing that is making sure that our DC rates reflect the actual growth-related costs that we face. And so that's one reason why it's important to move now as opposed to later.
I don't see our director has very many gray hairs yet, so I don't think she's that concerned about it.
I won't speak for her.
So Adam, if I may, so these numbers, and Watson, these numbers are based on the provincial growth numbers that they're forecasting for our municipality, correct?
Correct, Mr. Mayor.
And are we meeting those provincial growth numbers? You and me have had this conversation. Are we even close to meeting those provincial growth numbers at this point?
No, Mr. Mayor, you do know the answer to that, and probably most of the council does as well. I believe we're at about 1/3 of what those projections are. If you look at our permits and you look at the revenue that's come in, it's about 1/3 of what is projected.
And I only say that because I never ask a question I don't know the answer to. But I say that because, you know, when council's considering incentives to some of these rates, you know, keep that in mind. It's fine to say 50%, you know, from the industrial rate will go on the tax base, but if we've got no industrial growth, it's 50% of nothing. So, you know, we're trying to we're basing these numbers on a provincial rate that we're not hitting right now. So, you know, I hope council keeps that in mind to come up with something, what I would hope would be fair to say, you know, one day we'll probably be at these numbers, but how do we get from here to here? And do we need to offer a few incentives to sort of kickstart that process to get it going? Is there a cost to the taxpayer to do that? Probably in the short term, but in the long term with jobs and taxes that are collected from a business perspective, in my opinion, would more than make up for that and then get us up to where those numbers are. And if we suddenly take off with our growth numbers and start hitting these other 2/3 that we're short, is there any reason we can't come forward with another DC bylaw and make adjustments at that time before the 5 years expires?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, no, not at all. And in fact, as you know, a DC bylaw is a long process, and it does take a while to respond to changes.
Yeah.
And as Sean Michael mentioned, that's why we're trying to move all these measures into a policy, so that when we do take off, like you envision, we can adjust very quickly to those circumstances just simply by changing the policy through council resolution, and we don't have to go through the long, protracted legislative process.
So we can make adjustments to the policy and the
Yep.
incentives without changing the entire DC bylaw.
That's the intent eventually. So we're sort of halfway there at getting the policy together. With the DC task force, we've been referring to it as policy 1.0. The idea is that 2.0, which will come out about a year from now, along with the new community benefits charges bylaw, will fully encompass all of those incentives and have them fall under our community improvement plan, which is a process in itself to amend to have
Well,
this.
we'll have more discussion on that.
Yes.
I'm not sure that's the way to go, but I understand where you're coming from.
Yep.
A quick question for Carl, if I may. You talked about the Home Builders Association. Have there been any reaction from the Home Builders Association? We'll probably hear from them, but based on a 25% projected increase, has there been any feedback to date on those, that projected rate?
No, they haven't given specific feedback, other than just the only question that came back. So the staff member that's employed by PKHBA comes to some of the meetings, and she did bring some questions on the draft rates that you're looking at, and it was only about pulling out some of the specific projects, and it was particularly on the parks saw a very big increase, kind of in the 200 or 300% range, but it made up such a, as you saw in that pie chart, it's such a small, it's a fraction of the 11%, so it doesn't really make up a big component, and that sort of alleviated their concerns, so.
But they'll have an opportunity at the public meeting if they want to comment, correct?
Correct. We will make sure that there's a communication that goes out to them. I think that 25% might get some attention, so.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, we'd love to hear from them, for sure. Councillor Ashmore?
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Sean, I guess. If we reduced it by 50%, the industrial and the commercial, would it not be offset by the residential, like over in Northwest Trunk, there's potentially 5,000 homes? Like there's a lot of DCs that'll be coming out of that. Would that not offset the decrease that you're going to be, that we would propose with a 50% cut? And also, I think the city of Sudbury, they cut their industrial and commercial taxes, DCs, by 50%. I was just wondering if you ever looked into that and see how they did, or they're doing right now, like, because they actually did that. They have done that, Sudbury. And,
Sorry, say that in, they cut their taxes?
50%, yeah. And DC, sorry. The
DC.
development charges for industrial and commercial. I don't think it was the residential, but it was the industrial and commercial. Just thought maybe that's something to look into.
But that would be a council decision, correct, as part of a policy that we would put in place?
That's
And
correct.
that's one of the decisions we'll have to make.
Right. Well, just my question is, do you not calculate, or would you calculate theoretically like an increase in the revenue that comes in, even though you're reducing on one side, but you're increasing your residential? Because we are increasing residential quite a bit in this Northwest Trunk project.
Right, and so they don't directly offset each other, because in the calculation of the charges, the total growth rate costs are allocated partly to residential and partly to non-residential development as a first step. And so the development within the Northwest Trunk would be included within this denominator of residential development that we're calculating that a residential charge for over either the 10-year or 12-year forecast period. So whether that actual pace of development is accelerated or deferred, it doesn't actually change the calculation of that charge. And so if you have a delay in your non-residential growth and a pickup in the pace of your residential, there's not actually any cross-subsidy going on there. It's just some of those residential costs have been recovered at a quicker pace than was anticipated. And when you update your development charge background study and bylaw every 5 years as is required, that is then reconciled and self-corrected.
Councillor Dunn, you had a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, when is it payable from the taxpayer? On development?
No, so when the city would actually fund that revenue foregone is not legislated in the act. And so from what we recommend is one approach that we find somewhat administratively easy to impose is to track the total amount of all exemptions that are granted in a calendar year, and then to include that amount in the next year's budget as a transfer to the Development Charge Reserve Fund.
That's what I said. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, no, like, so it's not an upfront charge. So in 2020, we have zero industrial development. Am I still going to pay 50% of the rebate, or do I only pay that rebate at the time of the actual development?
So the city would only
Just like the developer would do.
Yes, so the city would only be funding the actual exemptions that occur. So if there is no industrial development, there is no industrial exemption to be funded.
Okay, so it doesn't help my fund a bit then, because if in fact we don't have the development, there's no extra money, actual hard cash going into the development charges reserve. It's still going to be as bare as Mother Hubbard's cupboard, unless we bring actual development in. Okay, that's fine.
Director, you had a comment? Did you want to add something?
Through you, I just wanted to add that we currently have $300,000 in the budget for 2020 to fund those types of exemptions in the event that they occur.
So if they don't occur, where does that money go? Does it go back in, so that, that $325,000 in 2020? If in fact it's not spent on development, what happens to the $325,000? Oh,
Through the mayor, if the $300,000 wasn't spent, then it would form part of the year-end surplus and would get rolled into general reserves or wherever we decide to put the surplus for that year.
It's just there to subsidize the development if it's needed. If there's no development, it's not needed, correct?
yeah, I've got that part of it, but, I mean, with all the other pressures our taxpayers are under, we have a potential of charging them an extra $325,000 that we're just gonna put in the kitty if in fact we don't spend it, as in opposed to actually meeting our budgetary needs up front and saying, this is what our needs are, but we're gonna put an extra $325,000 in there, and if in fact we don't actually use that money that we're required to use, then it goes into the fund. And so that's where I'm starting to have a problem with the process. If we're pre-funding something before we spend it, if it doesn't go into the development charge kitty, then when we finally have the development, I'm stuck with paying that $325,000 again, when in fact we actually have the development. So if the development doesn't take place into like, it just kind of goes around where we're just taking more and more money, and we may or may not actually spend that money where it's designed to be spent. That's where I'm starting to struggle with this question now.
So through the mayor, there are more than just industrial commercial exemptions. So there's a myriad of exemptions that currently exist in our DC bylaw that I believe totaled about $4 million when we did the reconciliation, because we weren't doing it on an annual basis. So the intent now, as Sean Michael was alluding, is that each year we will be funding the city's portion of any DC exemptions within that current year, so that we're not dealing with large amounts on a 4-year reconciliation or 5-year reconciliation.
So to Councillor Dunn's point, why wouldn't we take that $300,000 and just put it in the DC reserve? If we're budgeting for it and it passes at budget, why not just put it into the DC reserve and then it's there? And if we need it, and if we don't need it, we're helping to top up the reserve for the future. And it's there at some point, there's going to be enough incentives or offset to use it up. But why leave it at? Why not just pop it right into the DC reserve? Because I hear exactly what he's saying.
I think we'll find that we more than use up the $300,000 on an annual basis, but in the event that we don't, we could pass a resolution indicating that we're putting it into the DC reserve to fund future exemptions that may come along.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions, Councillor Riley?
Just a brief one, so maybe to Adam or Sean, when the next presentation, are you going to elaborate a little bit more on the community benefit charge? I know you touched on it today, but there's more to it, and I just thought, and I don't realize it's just a snapshot today, but.
So at the public meeting, the intent would not be to elaborate further on the community benefits charge for, I guess, 2 reasons. One being we may not have much further information at that time, depending on the province's release of the regulation, and also to focus the exercise on the development charges background study itself. I would anticipate that through staff, once there is further information and the final regulation is released, is that staff would be back to council to give you a more comprehensive update on the community benefits charge bylaw process.
Thank you. So you said a report's coming to council on October 22nd?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, we're endeavoring to target that date, but at the very latest, that report would come at the public meeting.
And you'll be, at that time,
yeah.
we're going to have a special council meeting following the public meeting. So if there's any direction you're looking for from council, that would be the opportunity to give it, correct?
Correct, that's right. Yeah, and there really isn't a huge difference between those 2 dates, given when we anticipate council to actually adopt the bylaw.
Well, it would be nice
Yeah.
to hear from some of the public comments before we make some recommendations, in my opinion, but
Yeah.
there's probably some recommendations we could make ahead of time, and then if we want to go any further, then we'll have that opportunity after the public meeting, correct?
Correct, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Any further questions? We have a motion to receive. All in favor? That's passed. Thanks, gentlemen, for coming. I appreciate it very much. Let's take a 2-minute break, a real quick break. Sorry, guys, I know you've been waiting over there patiently, but let's take a quick 2-minute break, and I mean 2 minutes, and we're going to come back and finish off our presentations. We got a bit more to get through. We're good. So item 5.3 is the Halliburton, Kawartha, Pine Ridge District Health Unit Climate Change Health Vulnerability and Adaptation Assessment. Wow, that's a long title. Sue Shikazi, did I pronounce that right?
You did, thank you.
Thank you. Is our health promoter. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I do work for the HKPR District Health Unit. I work as a health promoter out of our Halliburton office. So it's my pleasure to speak to City Council today about our Climate Change Health Vulnerability and Adaptation Assessment, or CCHVAA. You will see that acronym because it is a bit of a mouthful. So what I want to talk to you today just is a little bit about what the work is that we're doing and why we're doing it. I have a few preliminary findings to share with you, and then talk a little bit about what the role of the municipality is in relation to climate change and health, and in particularly vulnerability and adaptation. So this assessment is really intended to develop our understanding of the relationship between climate change and health within HKPR. So you know HKPR is City of Kawartha Lakes, Northumberland County, and also Halliburton. And the way that we're doing that is to look at what are the current climate change impacts across our district, what are the projections for how those are going to change in the future, and what are the current health impacts, and therefore what are the health impacts going to look like moving into the future. We're also looking at adaptation and how our programs at the health unit currently address adaptation to climate change related to health, and also initiatives in the community that do, so that we can then look at what else do we need to be looking at doing as we see the climate changing and the health impacts changing. It's also a great opportunity to collaborate with other sectors. So just a few key words to orient so we know we're all on the same page. Vulnerability is really the tendency of either a community or an individual or a population to be adversely affected by climate change. And so vulnerability is really a function of exposure to a climate health hazard, sensitivity to that hazard, and adaptive capacity. So by building adaptation and building adaptive capacity in individuals or in communities, we reduce their vulnerability, and that's really what this is about. Mitigation related to climate change it means reduction in greenhouse gases. That's out of scope of this project, but I thought I would put it up here on the screen just to let you know. So really we're focused on adaptation. The reason that we're doing this work is because we're being directed to do it by the OPHS, the Ontario Public Health Standards, which direct the work that we do across Ontario in public health. And there's actually a specific guideline that was just released in 2018 that talks about the need for the Board of Health to look at local needs related to the health impacts of climate change. And I think one of the reasons that we're being directed to do this work provincially is because, you know, when we talk about climate change, often it's about how do we reduce our carbon footprint, and it's looking at big global emissions reductions so that we don't, you know, the temperature doesn't go up by 1.5 degrees, those kinds of things. Very big picture. But the reality is we see the impacts of climate change locally and we feel them individually. So adaptation is really best addressed at a local level. It's also a great opportunity to partner with our municipalities and other community partners, because I know that the city has just completed a healthy environments plan that talks about climate change adaptation and mitigation within the city. So it's nice to be able to align with that. And it's also an opportunity for us to engage across our staff departments. There's lots of literature that shows that climate change does impact health, and in fact, the International Lancet Climate Change Commission identifies climate change as the greatest public health challenge of the 21st century. They also talk about it as a public health opportunity, because by talking about and showing the connections between climate change and health, it's a way to really make climate change more personal, bring it home, because where we feel the health impacts of climate change is as individuals, as families, and as communities. So it's a good way to, I think, localize and make more personal the impacts of climate change and potentially stimulate action. But there's also a widespread lack of awareness about the health impacts of climate change. Typically, when people talk about climate change, it's in relation to how it affects the environment. So part of our work is to raise awareness about climate change and the impacts on our health. So this image comes from the American Public Health Association. I'm not going to go over it in great detail, but what it does is it shows at the top level the climate impacts and the sort of environmental effects of those things. And at the bottom are the health effects. And these are the things that are of interest to us in public health. If you trace the orange boxes, you'll see that rising temperatures, which we know are an impact of climate change, lead to more heat waves, more extremely hot days. If you're in an urban area, you've got this urban heat island effect that makes the heat even worse. And what that leads to in terms of health is more incidence of things like heat stroke, dehydration, and also for people who have existing conditions like cardiorespiratory illness, they're much more sensitive and it can worsen those conditions as well. So that's all those reasons are why this work is of interest to us in public health. So it is a vulnerability assessment. Who is most vulnerable? There are populations across our district that we've identified as vulnerable through our work, and that includes seniors, children and infants, people who have existing mental health conditions, people who have asthma or other respiratory illnesses, pregnant women, people with disabilities, people living on low income, and people who work outdoors. So those are all people who are more vulnerable either because they're likely to be more exposed, they're more sensitive, or they lack adaptive capacity. So what are we doing? We have a toolkit that was prepared by the Ministry of Health to direct us in this work. So we're using that as a guideline in terms of organizing the work as we put it together. And we've divided it into two phases. So the first phase is really about the assessment and understanding the current condition. So within the HKPR district on the left, these are the questions that we're looking at answering. Who's most vulnerable? What's the historic and current climate situation? The current burden of illness related to those climate impacts? And what do we project the changes are going to be? And then what program, sort of an inventory of what programs exist within the health unit and in the community to contribute to adaptation, in particular related to those vulnerable groups. The climate-sensitive categories that we're looking at are listed on the right: extreme temperatures, extreme weather and natural events, so that includes things like floods, ice storms, wildfires. There's power outages associated with events like that. Vector-borne diseases, primarily Lyme disease and West Nile virus. Safe food and water, exposure to poor air quality, and exposure to solar ultraviolet radiation. So those are all identified in the literature as climate-influenced categories that impact health. The second phase is to then develop an adaptation plan that looks at what we find in the assessment, and moving forward, how do we address those health needs? What are we currently doing that we need to keep doing? What gaps exist in terms of what else we need to be doing? And who can we work with in the community to ensure that our community and our population is as protected as possible? So I wanted to share a little bit of our preliminary climate findings just to give you an idea of the kinds of things we're looking at. This shows you, this is from an online data source called the Ontario Climate Data Portal, and it shows you the number of tropical nights that are projected for the year 2050 and for the year 2080. So the historical reference period is data from 1981 to 2005. That's the small blue bar. City of Kawartha Lakes is the set in the middle. You'll see that by 2050, there's going to be around 30 of these tropical nights, and by 2080, it's projected that there will be about 55. And a tropical night is significant because these are nights where the temperature stays above 20 degrees. And so it means that the temperature during the day was even higher than that, and you don't get the cooling effect overnight. So that's an indicator of hot weather. So you can see anticipating a great deal more of that. We're also looking at hot days and how it compares with emergency department visits related to heat-related illness. So again, City of Kawartha Lakes is in the middle. This is data taken from Environment and Climate Change weather stations and shows the average monthly temperature, the average number of hot days per month for the period of 2010 to 2017. So this is actual weather station numbers. You'll see, no surprise, the highest number of hot days are in July and August, and the emergency department visits follow that trend. So more ED visits for heat-related illness in the months that are hot. So seeing that, we know that there's more hot days to come in the future. There's going to be more heat-related illness presenting in our healthcare system. We're also looking at precipitation. So a couple of indicators that I wanted to share with you. One is extremely wet days. So these are single days in which there's a really heavy rainfall, and then total annual precipitation. And then there's a baseline value, there's a 2050s value, and there's a 2080s value. And what's interesting about this is that by 2050, the total annual precipitation increases by 7%, and by 2080, it's projected to increase by 10%. But if you look at the increase on any given extremely wet day, the increase is 50%, and by 2080, it's almost 90%. So what that means is, overall, across the year, there's a slight increase in precipitation, but it's going to be concentrated more on those heavy precipitation days. So we'll see more extremes. The days we see a lot of rain, we'll see more of it, and we'll probably then also see more extremely dry days that compensate. So lots more highs and lots more lows. This shows for HKPR district the trend in terms of cases of Lyme disease. This is similar for Ontario and for Canada. Lots more cases of Lyme's disease, which follows the expansion of the range of black-legged ticks, the vector for Lyme. And so we see that growing every year. So some examples of some of the work that we currently do at the health unit related to adaptation. We do lots of surveillance, gathering of ticks, mosquitoes, identifying them for carrying the viruses that cause West Nile and Lyme disease. We have a heat alert notification system. We test beach water. So those are all actions that we do that sort of address the specific climate change impacts. There are also activities that we do that address the bigger picture, broader scope, and more root causes of vulnerability to climate change. So that would include things like working on healthy policies, the work that we do related to poverty reduction. Those are all intended to sort of look at a community level, how do we increase people's resilience and ensure that they've got the resources to reduce their vulnerability. So municipalities have an important role in climate change adaptation to health as well. And I know that as a municipality, you already work in collaboration with the health unit on a number of these kinds of initiatives. There's a lot of crossover between the work that you do and adaptation to climate change from a health perspective. So I know, for example, the Healthy Environments Plan has a health component in it. I was part of the working group on that, so I'm looking forward to that plan being moved forward to implementation. The policies and the planning decisions that you make also have an impact. For example, decisions about what your zoning looks like related to development on floodplains or potential floodplains, that kind of thing. Community emergency planning and preparedness obviously is one. Community infrastructure, things like provision of shade structures, trees, park and trail maintenance, and the provision of beaches. Energy and environmental initiatives, things like protecting wetlands, which can act as flood mitigation spaces, and also water quality and things like source water protection. So these are just some of the examples of the work that goes on at the municipality that also contributes to adaptation to health. So how can this project benefit you? It's an evidence-based document. We're big on evidence at the health unit, so you can see that we're looking at both climate and health data in this work. So we see it adding a detailed health lens to the work that's already been done in the Healthy Environments Plan. It provides an analysis of past and projected climate changes and how it will affect the health of local populations, especially those that are most vulnerable. And it also speaks to how other municipal initiatives, such as poverty reduction and implementation of the Healthy Environments Plan, are all interconnected. So part of the work is to look at how lots of different aspects of work that's going on in the community contributes to adaptation to health. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it brings climate change to a local and a personal level. So what's next is we're developing a communication campaign to make the public more aware of the links between climate change and health. We did some community consultations, conducted key informant interviews and focus groups over the spring and summer, currently making presentations to our partner municipalities, councils. The goal is to have the phase 1 draft complete by the end of this year, with the adaptation plan phase 2 completed by June of next year. And I've got some ongoing communication with staff who've been involved with the Healthy Environments Plan, and will continue to communicate with them to look for synergies and opportunities to collaborate on this work moving forward. So thanks for the opportunity to share that, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you. We'll get a motion to receive. Councillor Helmsley, seconded by Councillor Vale. Councillor Helmsley, you had a question? Notice I said a question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you, thank you, Sue, for coming today and for presenting this. You have an ambitious timeline to get this done by the end of December, and phase 2 started in June. Is that sufficient time, and will you be reporting back to the municipalities as you can?
Well, I always think it's good to have a goal. You're right, it is a very big project, but we've been at this now for a little over a year. And it's certainly, it's taking more time than I had anticipated to gather the data, analyze it, and put it together in a cohesive kind of way. So I'm guardedly optimistic that the draft, at least, can be ready by the end of the year. It won't be a finished, polished product, but at least the information will all be in one place so that we can then move into the next phase. And, you know, it's not a linear process either. It's not like you do this and this and this. Things sort of cycle and pieces feed into the other. So, you know, I think that the whole, I would hope that both phases will be done by later on in 2020. And yeah, I certainly would anticipate coming back to council and providing an update at some point in 2020. I think communication is really helpful. Yeah.
Any further questions? That's important work. Thank you for sharing it with us, and we look forward to those documents.
Thank you.
We have a motion to receive. All in favor? Let's pass. Thank you very much. Our last presentation, they've been hanging in here with us, is item 5.4, Haliburton Kawartha Lakes Northumberland Drug Strategy. Megan Diamond and Mark Mitchell. Welcome.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having us here to do what I hope will be a relatively quick presentation on the Haliburton Kawartha Lakes Northumberland Drug Strategy. The reason I'm here is that we are one of four partner agencies that applied for the grant to create the drug strategy in 2016. At the end of 2016, the strategy got down to work in 2017. And the driving force behind the drug strategy is here to my right, Megan Damon, who's been in the role of coordinator since 2018. You'll notice that she might be a little athletically impaired today, so please bear with her. But I will turn the floor over to her, and I will be back in a couple minutes to speak to some of the more local impacts that we're facing.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for inviting us here today to speak a little bit more about the drug strategy, the work that we've been doing on a local level as well as a district level, so working in the 2 other counties as well. And I hope to speak to, although we do focus as a drug strategy on all harms related to substance use at both an individual and community level, I'll be focusing today's presentation on opioid-related harms specifically, looking at some of the responses that we're seeing at all levels of government, and also looking to some opportunities here at the local level. Okay, so just to start for a drug strategy structure just generally, substance use continues to be an identified area of concern for both stakeholders and residents of the Kawartha Lakes area. And then we're going to speak to a little bit more to the need for a comprehensive and coordinated approach to addressing some of these concerns and issues at the Kawartha Lakes area. And so our drug strategy, so the drug strategy of Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, and Northumberland, we do not operate as an individual organization, but we act as a collective mechanism for agencies and community members to gather to achieve common goal on built capacity that each agency or individual wouldn't have otherwise. So while vested partners that are involved in this collective mechanism, they do have some vested interest in reducing harms. It doesn't necessarily involve the entirety of their portfolio, but it does relate some way to their organizational mandate or vision. And so we do use, as a drug strategy, we're very up on the evidence-informed practice, using best practices as we can to really tailor a local response. And one great thing that we do have benefit of is that there are 39 drug strategies across Ontario, and we make up a provincial body called the Municipal Drug Strategy Coordinators Network of Ontario, also called MDSCNO. And the really great thing about this provincial body is that we can learn from each other, improve and strengthen our individual approaches, and really stay abreast of emerging trends and best practices to reducing harms. And so, as Chief Mitchell alluded to already, our drug strategy is founded on a 3-year Ontario Trillium Foundation grant. We were awarded this grant in 2016 with 4 partners coming together to write that. And we are nearing the end of that 3-year grant, December of this year. And since 2016, we've really spent a lot of time implementing and evaluating the recommendations that we identified from a fairly intensive consultation process that took place in 2016 and 2017. And we've been working on these recommendations through a series of time-limited projects, as well as ongoing objectives to increasing education and awareness about some of the harms we're seeing attributed to substance use locally. And so I spoke to the evidence base behind drug strategies just previously, and we do operate what's known as a 4-pillar approach. So this is something that we see at a federal level and provincial level as well, where we look at the combined forces of 4 pillars, so harm reduction, prevention and education, treatment, and justice and enforcement. And so what this really is more of a comprehensive collaborative approach that uses a public health lens to addressing addressing drug-related issues and trends locally. And so, as we alluded to, the 4 agencies that came together to write this grant in 2016, but what is most significant is that we've actually grown this membership to quite a robust number of agencies, to be about 52 agencies throughout the 3 counties, and then also that's made up of roughly 80 individuals to some capacity involved in the drug strategy work throughout the 3 counties. And so we've been quite successful over the last 3 years and played a very effective role in bringing diverse groups together and reducing the harms associated with substance use. We've led a number of great campaign works and trainings, also played a really big role in enhancing and supporting ongoing programs, so namely the Harm Reduction Works program, which is led by the Health Unit, as well as the establishment of an HKPR district task force that will focus on increasing our access to coordinated data around opioid-related events, but also doing a coordinated response to that as well. And so when I spoke to previously about the extensive consultation process that we engaged in, we had over 500 surveys being completed by our residents of the 3 counties, and almost 80 individual interviews held with service providers. So that was really to gain a sense of what were some of the priorities that we were seeing, and what were some of the harms that people wanted us to address. So in the city of Kawartha Lakes, some of the top concerns for residents and service providers were around crime and community safety, impaired driving, children and youth, and access to diversified and alternative options for various types of services. And so when we break these down, and this was included in your agenda package, we see that a number of the priorities for folks living throughout the 3 counties tends to be around opioid-related harms and services, so continuing to be a top priority there. Okay. So one of the concerns that we do have, so I just want to get on the same page around opioid-related harms, but with the small caveat is that we don't, at the moment, have municipal or county-level data that would allow us to comprehensively look at what are some of the harms that we're facing at a local level. So what we do have in terms of data are pulled from what the health unit has access to. So we can look at things like emergency department visits, hospitalizations, and mortality rates as well as they relate to opioid-related events. And as you can see from these data figures, we are seeing an increase or an uptick when we're comparing 2017 numbers with 2018 numbers. So I will turn it over back to Chief Mitchell to talk about further data.
Thanks, Megan. So locally, I can tell you that we've had 75 suspected. Where am I pointing this? We've had 75 suspected overdose incidents. Out of that, we had a significant spike in volume in the period between February and May, where we averaged about 15 to 20 overdose incidents per month. And before and after that period, our numbers are about 3 per month. So significant change. That coincides with the arrival of purple heroin in our community. And while I would like to, I'd like to say it's no longer here, we know that that's not true. And I would attribute in part the reduction in those numbers to some of those harm reduction and education efforts that the drug strategy is undertaking, and also to a shifting role away from from our perspective, from some of the traditional police intervention methods to some more non-traditional initiatives that we've introduced recently. But I would also have to caution that as members of the drug community become more adept at treating those overdose incidents, they're utilizing emergency services at a lower rate as well. So that could attribute for some of the lower numbers. And we know that 68% of our drug charges currently are opioid related. Just a couple of things. I know that you still have other things on your agenda, so I'm just going to breeze through and highlight a couple of statistics for your information. You'll see in this chart a significant spike in both opioid-related deaths and visits to the emergency department, particularly in 2017 and 18. And that is HKPR specific data. And then you can see that that corresponds directly with a spike in the number of incidents where fentanyl is involved. So looking at the provincial data, and Megan spoke about some of the gaps in data collection that we have locally, and that's one of the things that we're working on. And anytime that you deal with private health information, there's understandable concerns about the sharing of that data. But I look at what's going on in other municipalities, and certainly at West, where we've seen these trends originate and make their way across the country. I know that there's ways to overcome those challenges and make our data collection better and more useful so that we can better direct our efforts in tackling these problems. But if we look at the Ontario data, 1,300 deaths in the 12-month period between July of 2017 and June 2018. And a couple of the key findings there, 90% of those deaths were accidental, and fentanyl is involved in roughly three-quarters of those incidents, as you can see there as well. If you look in the lower right there, you see a particular gap, one of those information gaps that I was talking about. We have too much unknown data at this point, and we know if you're a data person at all, if you look up the City of Surrey opioid reports, you'll see an example of what can be accomplished in terms of collecting data that provides tremendous value to the entire drug enforcement effort. You see overrepresentation in certain industries, as well as the predominant occurrence inside private residences, and also where individuals are alone or have limited assistance at the time. Almost half of the incidents involve a resuscitation attempt, and 1 in 5 incidents where naloxone was administered. This slide here I'll just quickly go over. This is Center for Disease Control model out of the States, and you know, I would caution against directly applying the same ratios here, but if we use that as a rough model, if we look at our current statistics just locally in our policing jurisdiction with 7 potential deaths related to opioid, if you translate that down to what we don't know, that roughly comes almost to 6,000 incidents that we're not aware of, that aren't being reported. And the last thing I'll speak to, again, is some of that non-traditional work that we've gotten into. So you look over at the Justice and Enforcement pillar, and things like the Mobile Response Unit, which we've had in place on the mental health side for a couple of years. But this year we've just introduced that model with an addictions counselor teamed up with an officer to go out into the community. And they have done, just in this so far year to date alone, they've done 77 outreach assessments with addictions related individuals in our community. And that work is paying tremendous dividends for us in terms of reducing recidivism, introducing people to early treatment options, and monitoring those conditions. So that's some of the work that we've done that in years past we would have never considered as a police role. But certainly as we look at that whole of government, if I could put it that way, approach, more and more of those areas that we're getting involved in. So I'm going to turn it back over to Megan for some concluding thoughts.
Thank you. And I just want to point out that this slide to me really shows the great strides we're making in this community into community well-being and reducing that harm. And we see that when we are really using that 4-pillar approach to be a very comprehensive approach, we are able to make very good strides in that direction. So that being said, I also, in addition to pointing out kind of our local responses, I'm wanting to also point to some of the opioid responses that we are seeing at a provincial level as well. So included in your agenda package, you will see jury recommendations that were put forward from a Chapman inquest case. And this came about in 2015 when Bradley Chapman lost his life in Toronto due to an opioid-related event. So the coroner's inquest just recently, in end of 2018, put out a very comprehensive list of recommendations to help municipalities, the province, as well as certain sectors to play a really big role in reducing opioid-related deaths, both at a local and provincial level. And then what we saw recently in September of 2019 was that the Association of Municipalities Ontario just put forward a recommendation for provincial response, and again, very aligned with the recommendations that were put forward in that Chapman inquest. And not to forget that we also have a centrally linked opioid strategy that's been in operation for a couple of years now and has made just actually put out a progress report, so they're making great strides there as well. And so I did pull out those kind of first two documents because I wanted to show some momentum that we're seeing at a regional level as well. So in April of this year, Deputy Mayor Sherry Senes put actually recommendations from that Chapman inquest forward to Peterborough County Council in the way of a motion to battle what the effects that they're feeling locally from an opioid crisis. And so we've had similar movements be adopted, I guess, from a municipal level. So we had Cobourg Town Council just hosted a roundtable on opioid-related concerns, and one of the recommendations put forward was a motion to go forward to adopt these AMO recommendations as well. So we are seeing some momentum around some guiding frameworks, and I think that's just to show that we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel when we're looking at a municipal response. I think we have some really great foundational components. We also have, I think, great alignment with some plans that are coming out at a municipal or provincial level as well. So we can look at things like community safety and well-being plans. We can look at the implementation of Ontario Health Teams. I spoke previously about the HKPR District Opioid Task Force that's being led by the Health Unit. So they're doing some great work with surveillance and response there. And also just speaking previously about the local foundations that the drug strategy, or the HKL and drug strategy specifically, has laid in this area with the very great connections that we've been made, the memberships who are involved in the drug strategy and the work that's been continued to date. And then also looking at opportunities going forward to continue this discussion at a municipal level. So without further ado, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. We'll get a motion to receive. We'll see if there's any questions. Councillor O'Reilly and Richardson. Questions? Councillor O'Reilly, go ahead.
Just a quick one. Thanks for the presentation, both of you. It's, not only be an expert on opioids, be an expert on development charges after sitting through that today, I'm sure, as well. But anyways, with our proximity to Peterborough, maybe through to you, Mark, through you, Mr. Mayor, to Mark, is there potential, or is there a more likelihood, I guess, that it would spread to Lindsay? Because I think they are one of the municipalities that's been identified in the province as having a very high rate, well, death rate even of opioids.
Yes, certainly we've seen that spike in activity there. I know Peterborough's been very active in that regards, and as I noted earlier, this is a phenomena that kind of originated out west and has really migrated east and has really started to hit Ontario in the last 12 to 18 months. And we've seen our numbers increase in that period of time, not to the extent that Peterborough, but I would be remiss to not think that we're going to see some of that impact and that our numbers aren't going to increase if we're not proactive in dealing with that problem.
Councillor Elmsley, question?
No, Mr. Mayor, I have a resolution.
Okay, why don't we do that as a follow-up after the motion to receive, if that's okay? Councillor Ashmore, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Megan or Chief Mitchell. Two questions. What is your opinion on what has been done about prescription opioids? Has the medical community been contacted, or have you been in touch with them? Like, what's the strategy there in minimizing the prescription opioids, which are part of the problem?
Well, I know there's been a lot of initiatives. I'm sure everyone's aware of the recent rulings in the United States with regards to the manufacturers of certain opioids and the overprescription of them. I think it's an issue that's on the College of Physicians and Surgeons radar in terms of efforts to reduce the volume of prescriptions for opioid and the abuse of prescriptions of that nature. And I think that there's definitely a problem with prescription narcotics, but I think the bigger issue is the illegal manufacture of those opioid products and the importation of them into our country and into our communities. Do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I would just agree with Chief Mitchell here. I think what we're seeing is primarily we did see a shift around prescription use around opioids, but now we're seeing a lot of harm actually contributing with the illicit forms of opioids that we're seeing at both a street-based or illicit form. And then also to speak to that, I think we've had some really great momentum come at a provincial direction around new prescribing protocols. We had Health Quality Ontario release best prescribing protocols, and we have new training, and we have participating pharmacies that are participating in programs like naloxone distribution and that sort of thing. So.
And my final question is, and I just have to ask this, and I'm just trying to educate myself, but in Lindsay here, I don't know about some of the other communities, but Ontario Shores has a clinic where people go in and get methadone, methamphetamine. Why is that, like, under harm reduction, is that not something that encourages people to take more drugs and not kick the habit? I just always wanted to know why we have a clinic there, and I'm sure there's other ones, that doling out methamphetamines all the time, and people just keep coming in. It's a revolving door. Why can't we stop that?
Methamphetamines or methadone?
Meth. It's just meth. I'm not an expert in it, but methadone. Yeah.
Yes. So methadone is a drug that's prescribed to reduce the effects of addiction and urges. So I think there's a significant amount of clinical evidence to support a properly prescribed methadone program, and I think the results are there to support that. There are methadone clinics locally. The problem is that if we treat it from a perspective that we're looking for 100% success rate, I don't think that's achievable, and I think that's where some of the negative stigma comes from. But there are people that, whether they're on a methadone program or not, will continue to make poor choices. And so I think that's where we look at this whole of government approach, and I don't think we can ignore any of those 4 pillars, including justice and enforcement.
Any further questions? We have a motion to receive. All in favor? That's passed. Councillor Helmsley, had a follow-up motion?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I know you're excited about this, but...
I thought it was for the first presentation, but
I know.
go ahead.
Yeah. That human resource staff be directed to report back to council by the end of Q1 2020 with options for convening a community-based advisory group to support the drug strategy.
And this was recommended from the Director of Human Services,
That's
correct? Seconder, Councillor Yeo, thank you. Do you want to speak to it, or?
I think we've heard the presentation. Hopefully, the situation is going to improve, but as a former councillor once said, hope is not a strategy, so I think we need to do something to ensure that we get on top of this and do everything we can in order to try and mitigate against it.
Sounds good. You're okay? You're good? Any questions? All in favor? That's passed. Thanks very much for your presentation, sharing that with us today. It's good work. Keep up the good work. Thank you. Okay, we'll move into, you got to go. Yep, thank you. Just gonna. Okay, we'll move into 6.1.1. We'll get a couple of reports and then a couple of memos. The Fenelon Falls Power Links funding request, that the report be received and that the Power Links Committee contribute $5,335 to the Fenelon Falls Horticultural Society with the allocation to come from the Power Links Reserve, and that this recommendation be brought forward to Council at the next meeting. Councillor Helmsley, you'll move that. Seconder, Councillor O'Reilly? Yes, any comments, questions? All in favor? That's passed. Thank you. 612 is the farm tax ratio review that was asked of staff. That report 219-026 farm tax ratio review be received, and that this recommendation be brought forward to council for consideration at the next regular council meeting. A motion to receive? Councillor Ashmore, Councillor O'Reilly, questions, comments? Question? Councillor Helmsley, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. My report just says to be received. You said to bring it forward for...
Yeah, the receive motion has to be brought forward to council. That's what we do.
Oh, okay.
This is just committee of the whole, so
Did you not say that, and that the recommendations be adopted?
that this recommendation be brought forward, the received recommendation be brought forward to council for consideration at the next regular council meeting.
Okay,
The recommendation is just to receive it.
thank you.
Okay? Any other questions? All in favor? That's passed. Thank you. Correspondence is a memo regarding the response time standard notification. Sarah Johnson, who's here, our acting deputy chief of paramedic services, that the October 8th memorandum, blah, blah, response time be received, that the attached letter dated September 18th and addressed to interim director of hospitals and emergency service division regarding response time notification be received for information, and again, that this recommendation be brought forward to council. Sarah, do you want to give us a 30-second overview? Do you mind? Just, I know I had a question for you earlier about, are we changing response times, or just maybe you can just give us a quick hit on why this is coming forward.
I like the blah blah.
You like that? Okay.
Yeah. So as per the Ambulance Act, municipalities are required to set response time targets and performance and report annually to the Ministry of Health. And that plan outlines how fast an ambulance is likely to get to your location based on CTAS level. So not knowing where everybody's at for definitions, CTAS we use pre-hospitally to define how sick a patient is. So anywhere from CTAS 1, meaning that the patient's very sick and requires a lot of care, right through to 5, which is non-urgent. So while we set those response times based on a variety of factors, population density, our current resources, historical data, it's important that you know that we're reporting on behalf of the municipality. And as such, with that submission coming from yourselves, that everybody's on the same page for response time performance plans, the targets, and the times that we're setting for an ambulance to get to everybody within the community.
Perfect, thank you. Can I get a motion as printed? Councillor Seymour Fagan, Councillor Richardson, any questions for Sarah? Seeing none, all in favor? That's passed, thank you. Item 6.2.2 is a memo from Councillor Ashmore regarding alternative financing for capital and operating pressures. Motion that the memorandum be received, that staff be directed to study alternative sources of funding for Kawartha Lake's capital and operating needs, that staff explore the creation of Kawartha Lake savings bonds as a method of increasing our capital funding, and that staff report back to council by the end of Q3 2020 with alternatives and additions to the current sources of funding for capital and operating budget, and that this recommendation be brought forward to council at the next regular council meeting. Your memo, you'll move that, Councillor Ashmore? Second, Councillor O'Reilly. Questions? Or actually, let me see if Councillor Ashmore wants to speak to it first. Do you want to speak to it, or?
What it is when we had our inaugural meeting, the mayor said, if you have an idea, bring it forward. And I've talked to the mayor about it. I've talked to Director Stover about it. I met her in her office in May. So it's not something I've sprung on to staff. We're talking about 1 year. So we don't have to impact on the workload of staff for this budget session. So it's going to be a year before this comes back, which is fine. I'm fine with that. So it's just a exploratory report to look at different options. It's just, that's all it's about, and nothing more. That's all I'm asking for, is just a report from staff.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
I think we should ever be afraid to explore different options. So thank you. Councillor Helmsley had a question?
Thanks. Just briefly, through you to Director Stover. If we floated savings bonds as a revenue source, does that count as debt?
That's a very good question. I would assume that it does, but I don't know the answer to that.
Could you please include that in the report?
We absolutely will.
And what the implications of that would be on our debt ratio, kind of. Thank you.
Any further questions? Call the question. All in favor? That's passed. Thank you. Item 6.2.3 is a memo regarding the draft development charges background study. which is just outlining some of the policy and direction that we're taking, kind of an overview of today's presentation. Can I get a motion that the October 7th, 2019 memorandum from Adam Found regarding draft development charges background study be received? Councillor O'Reilly and Richardson, all in favor? That's passed. And 624 is a memo from Councillor Elmsley regarding full winter maintenance for cul-de-sac accessing Francis Street, Fenland Falls. The motion that the memorandum be received, that the cul-de-sac encompassing properties 202 to 210 receive full winter maintenance for the 2019-2020 winter season, as they have been, correct? And that staff report back to council at the end of Q1 2020 with background regarding this cul-de-sac and recommendations for municipal maintenance moving forward. And again, that this recommendation be brought forward to council. Your memo, you'll move that, Councillor Elmsley? Thank you. Seconder? Councillor O'Reilly? Do you want to speak to it? It speaks for itself. Okay. Any questions, comments? All in favor? That's passed. We have nothing for closed. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Elmsley and Richardson, all in favor? That's passed. Thank you.